Horace Blackwood smiled the smile of a man who believed he had already won. Yes, he said. Yes, I ordered the tonic. Yes, I ordered the tree. It was supposed to kill all three of you. And then across the room, the crippled man in the wheeled chair pulled the quilt from his lap, and he stood up. 6 feet, 6 inches of bone and iron while standing on legs that a doctor had said would never move again. Blackwood's mouth fell open. But to understand how a paralyzed mountain man came to stand in his own parlor 1 year to the day after his bride first stepped off the train from Philadelphia, we must go back to a November morning in 1880 and to a letter found in a dead man's coat pocket. The wind came down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that November morning in 1880, sharp as a skinning knife, and it carried with it the smell of pine and wood smoke and something older, something that belonged to the high country alone. Samuel Broderick stood at the edge of the freshly turned earth with his hat in his hands and his jaw set like a man who had forgotten how to cry, and he watched his two younger brothers lower their father into the frozen ground. The grave had been hard work. Barnabas had swung the pickaxe for most of the morning, his breath coming out in white clouds, his shoulders moving with the patient, terrible rhythm of a man who refused to stop until the job was done. Ezekiel had shoveled behind him, his left hand on the handle and his right arm doing the heavy work, for in those days Zeke still had two good hands and did not yet know what it meant to lose one. Samuel had stood apart because Samuel was the oldest, and the oldest son in the Broderick family did not weep and did not weaken no matter what was asked of him. Elias Broderick had been 68 years old when the lung fever took him. He had built the cabin at Silver Pine Ranch with his own hands in 1848, back when Colorado was still a rumor and a prayer, and he had raised 3 sons there after his wife Martha died, bringing Barnabas into the world. He had taught them to read by firelight and to shoot by moonlight and to pray on their knees each morning before the sun crested the ridge. And now he was gone, and the mountains did not seem to notice, and that was the cruelest part of all. When the last shovelful of earth had been patted down, Samuel placed a small bouquet of dried yarrow on the grave. His mother had loved yarrow. His father had remembered. Samuel cleared his throat. "Lord," he said, and his voice was rough as riverstone, "you gave us a good father. We thank you for the gift. We ask you to receive him home. Amen." Zeke and Barnabas said amen, and then the 3 of them stood there in the biting wind with nothing more to say. The oldest of them was 34. The youngest was 32. They had no mother, no father, no wife between them. Only each other and the mountain and the ranch their father had left behind. It was Barnabas who finally broke the silence. Barnabas, who spoke rarely but well, who carried the scar of a grizzly bear across his left cheek like a signature, who had grown into the quietest and perhaps the wisest of the 3. "We should go through his things," Barnabas said, "before the snow comes harder." They rode back to the cabin together, 3 tall brothers on 3 tall horses, casting long shadows across the pale grass. None of them knew it then, but in the breast pocket of their father's old wool coat, folded 3 times and sealed with a drop of red wax, there lay a letter that was about to change all of their lives forever. Samuel found it that evening. He had volunteered to sort through his father's clothing, for he was the oldest, and such duties fell to him. The coat was laid across the back of a chair, smelling of tobacco and cedar, and the particular scent of an old man who had worked outdoors his whole life. Samuel held it for a long moment before he began to empty the pockets. A pocket knife, a stub of pencil, a folded receipt from the general store in Oak Haven, and then from the breast pocket closest to the heart, the letter. It was addressed in his father's careful hand to the Winchester Marriage Bureau of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Samuel sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. He broke the wax seal with his thumbnail and unfolded the paper, and by the light of a single oil lamp, he read the words his father had written in the last months of his life. "To whomever oversees the Winchester Marriage Bureau, I write on behalf of my eldest son Samuel, who is 34 years of age and the finest man I have ever known, though he does not know it of himself. He works every hour God gives him. He has never taken a wife because he has spent his youth raising his 2 younger brothers and caring for a dying old man. He does not complain. He does not ask. I have watched him grow into a good, strong silence, and I fear that silence will become his tomb if no one comes to break it. I have not told him of this letter. I do not know if I will live to see it answered. But if you could find a woman of Christian character, plain good sense, and a brave heart who might consider making the long journey out to Colorado territory, you would be doing a great work. My son does not believe he deserves happiness. I mean to prove him wrong. Your servant in the Lord Elias Broderick, Silver Pine Ranch. Samuel read it twice. Then he set the letter down on the bed beside him, and for the first time since the funeral, the iron in his chest cracked, and the tears came down his weathered face in slow, silent lines. His father had spent the last months of his life trying to arrange a wife for him. His father had loved him that much. The door creaked open behind him. Zeke stood in the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand, reading his brother's face in a single practiced glance. "What is it, Sam?" Samuel handed him the letter. Zeke read it and his jaw tightened, and he turned and called for Barnabas. The three brothers stood together in the small bedroom, and the letter passed from hand to hand. And when Barnabas finished reading it, he folded it carefully and handed it back to Samuel. "We have to write to them," Samuel said. "We have to tell them Father has passed. Some poor woman might be on her way already, and it would not be right." Zeke set his coffee down. "No," he said. Samuel looked up. "No, Sam," Zeke said, and his voice had that particular flatness it took on when he had made up his mind about a thing. "Father spent his last strength on this letter. He did not do it out of fancy. He did it because he loved you, because he could not bear the thought of leaving you alone. You will not dishonor him by tearing it up." "Zeke, I am a 34-year-old rancher with no proper house and less savings. I have no business bringing a city woman out here under false promises." "Then do not make false promises," Barnabas said quietly from the doorway. "Write her the truth. Let her choose." The truth! Samuel turned the word over in his mouth like a stone. The three brothers stood in the small room, and the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and somewhere out in the dark, an owl called across the snow. Samuel picked up a sheet of clean paper. He dipped his father's pen in the inkwell, and he began to write. He did not promise the woman wealth. He did not promise her ease. He wrote of the mountains in winter and the wildflowers in spring. He wrote of his two brothers and how they would love her as blood. He wrote of a small cabin with a stone fireplace and a view of the western range. He wrote that he was not a handsome man, that he was plain-spoken, that he went to bed tired and woke up tired, and that the only thing he could truly offer her was his word. He signed it, "Yours respectfully, Samuel Broderick." He did not expect a reply. 3 months passed, the snow came and went, the cattle were thin by February. In March, a telegram arrived at the Oak Haven Depot, and the station master sent a boy up to Silver Pine with it. Samuel took the yellow paper from the boy's hand and read it standing on his own porch. "Mr. Samuel Broderick, Silver Pine Ranch, Colorado Territory, stop. Miss Cordelia Ashford has accepted your proposal. Stop, she arrives Oak Haven May 14th. Stop, Winchester Marriage Bureau, Philadelphia." Samuel read the words 4 times before the meaning settled into him. Cordelia Ashford, a woman he did not know was coming across half a continent to marry him. A woman who had read his letter and decided for reasons known only to herself and to God that a plain rancher in Colorado was worth the long, hard ride from Philadelphia. He stood on the porch for a long time after the boy had ridden away. He did not know whether to laugh or to pray. In the end, he did both. 3 weeks later, the tree fell. It was a Tuesday morning in late April, and the 3 brothers had ridden up to the North Cut to finish the winter's timber. The sky was blue as a robin's egg. The saws were sharp. Samuel had his hand on the trunk of an old ponderosa pine, reading its lean, the way their father had taught them, when something in the wood groaned low, like a man waking from a bad dream. Barnabas looked up. Zeke shouted something that Samuel did not hear clearly, and then the mountain itself seemed to shift, and the great pine came down the wrong way. Samuel did not remember the impact. He remembered a sound like a cannon shot. He remembered the smell of sap and blood. He remembered Zeke crawling toward him through the snow, with one arm dragging behind him and his right shoulder twisted at an angle that was wrong in a way that made Samuel's stomach turn. He remembered Barnabas standing over them both, his left cheek open to the bone by a whipping branch, the blood running down into his beard, his eyes wide with a kind of terror that Samuel had never seen in his brother before. "Sam! Sam, can you hear me?" Samuel could hear. Samuel could speak, but when Samuel tried to move his legs, nothing happened. Nothing at all. They brought him down the mountain on a travois made of their own coats and two lodgepoles. Doc William Higgins came up from Oak Haven and spent 3 hours at the bedside. When he came out of the room, his face was gray as ash. "His spine is crushed," Higgins said. "He will not walk again. He may not live out the year." Zeke set his jaw. Barnabas put a hand on the old man's shoulder and said softly, "You will not say those words in this house again, Doctor. Not where Sam can hear them." The weeks that followed were a country none of them had ever traveled before. Zeke's right arm would never lift above his head again. The old wound from Gettysburg, buried under 18 years of silence, had been torn open by the falling pine and had knit back wrong. Barnabas healed fast, for Barnabas always healed fast, but the scar across his left cheek was a cruel red thing that pulled the corner of his mouth when he tried to smile, and the children in town had already begun to call him Scarbarn behind his back. And Samuel the eldest, the head of the family, the one who had carried them all, lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling and watched his legs grow smaller beneath the quilt. In the third week of his convalescence, a second telegram arrived. Zeke opened it at the bedside because Samuel did not have the strength that morning to sit up. "Mr. Samuel Broderick, stop. Miss Ashford departs Philadelphia tomorrow. Stop expected Oak Haven. May 14th as arranged. Stop Winchester Bureau." Samuel closed his eyes. "Lord in heaven," he whispered. "What have I done?" Zeke sat down on the edge of the bed. Barnabas leaned against the doorframe. "She is coming, Sam," Zeke said. "She cannot come. She is already coming. You cannot stop her." "Then I will send her back the moment she steps off that train." "Sam, I am a cripple, Zeke. Look at me. I cannot even sit up without help. I will not tie some poor woman to a dead man." "You are not dead." "I am close enough." Barnabas spoke from the doorway, his voice low and even. "You will let her choose, Samuel." Father said it. "Let her choose, that is all we can do." Samuel did not answer. He turned his face to the wall and the brothers left him alone, and outside the cabin, the spring wind moved through the pines and carried the smell of melting snow down toward the plains, toward the railroad, toward a young woman who was at that very moment boarding an eastbound coach in Philadelphia with a small leather trunk and a Bible and a sealed letter tucked inside her traveling dress. Cordelia Ashford was 22 years old. She had honey blonde hair that fell past her shoulders when she let it down, and large cornflower blue eyes and a face that strangers often called delicate, though those who knew her knew better. She was the only daughter of the late Reverend Tobias Ashford of Philadelphia, a man who had been a chaplain in the Army of the Potomac and who had come home from the war with a limp and a library and a ferocious conviction that his daughter should be educated in the same way his son would have been had God given him a son. He had taught Cordelia Latin and Greek. He had taught her bookkeeping, for he managed the parish accounts. He had taught her the uses of yarrow and willow bark and comfrey root, for a pastor of the poor was half a country doctor, whether he liked it or not. And he had taught her that a woman who kept her word was the nearest thing this world had to an angel. He had died of a chill in the winter of 1879, 3 days after Christmas. Cordelia had nursed him to the end and had read the 23rd Psalm over his grave in a voice that had not trembled once because her father had asked her not to tremble, and she had never refused him anything. After his death, a kindly but thin-faced man named Reverend Percival Thorne had taken over the parish. For 18 months, Cordelia had kept the books for him as she had for her father. She lived in a small room above the vestry mended altar. Cloths played the pump organ on Sundays, and tried to believe that her life was still good. It was in September of 1880 that she had found the discrepancy. She was a careful girl with numbers. Her father had trained her that way. And when she saw that the widow's fund ledger showed a disbursement of $42 to a family named Gallagher in Chester County, she had taken it upon herself to write a polite letter of Christian greeting to the Gallaghers, for her father had always sent such letters, and she meant to continue the practice. The letter came back marked no such family at this address. Cordelia had checked her books 3 times. Then she had checked Reverend Thorne's ledger. Then she had found 7 more disbursements to families that did not exist. Over the course of 18 months, nearly $300 had been directed from the widow's fund into the Reverend's personal account. She had gone to him. She had been raised to believe that confronting sin was a duty of Christian love. She had sat in his study with the ledger on her lap and had asked him respectfully to explain the entries. Reverend Thorne had leaned back in his chair and had smiled at her the way a cat smiles at a bird. "My dear Miss Ashford," he had said, "you are very clever, but you are a young unmarried woman living alone in the vestry of a church, and if you breathe one word of this to anyone, I will tell the deacons that you have been throwing yourself at me, and they will believe me, and you will be ruined. Do you understand me?" She had understood him. She had walked out of the study on legs that barely held her. She had spent the next 4 nights on her knees in prayer. And on the 5th night, she had taken down the bundle of newspapers that came weekly to the parish, and she had turned to the advertisements, and she had read a small notice placed by the Winchester Marriage Bureau on behalf of a rancher in Colorado Territory who was seeking a wife of Christian character, plain good sense, and a brave heart. She had written to the Bureau that same night. 3 weeks later, a letter had come back from Colorado. It was written in a careful hand on plain brown paper, and it did not promise her wealth, and it did not promise her ease, and it spoke of mountains and wildflowers, and 2 brothers who would love her as blood. And when Cordelia had read it a second time, she had laid her head down on the little desk and had wept the first honest tears she had wept since her father died. She had written back the next morning. Yes, she had said, "I will come." Now sitting on the train as the great rolling plains of Kansas slipped past the window, Cordelia Ashford held that letter in her hands and read it again. She had read it so often that the creases were beginning to fray. She did not know the face of the man she was going to marry. She only knew his words. And she had decided somewhere between Philadelphia and St. Louis that his words were enough. She prayed. She slept sitting up. She ate little. When the train crossed the Colorado line and the mountains rose up in the distance like a wall of blue stone, she pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass of the window, and she whispered a line from the psalm her father had loved best. "I will lift up mine eyes into the hills." On the afternoon of May 14th, the train pulled into the little depot at Oak Haven, and Cordelia Ashford stepped down onto the wooden platform with a small leather trunk beside her, and she looked up and down the empty platform and saw that no one was there to meet her. The station was quiet. A stray dog slept under a bench. The station master tipped his hat and went back inside. Cordelia stood alone with her trunk and the Colorado sun beat down on her navy traveling dress, and she felt her heart begin to tighten in her chest. And then a man came walking up the platform from the direction of the main street. He was not young. He was perhaps 58 with silver in his mustache and a heavy gold watch chain across a black waistcoat, and he walked with the easy confidence of a man who owned whatever ground he stood upon. Behind him came another man in a sheriff's star, and 2 more men in cattlemen's coats with their thumbs hooked in their belts. The older man removed his hat. "Miss Ashford, I presume?" "Yes, sir." "Horace Blackwood. I run the largest ranch in this valley. I am a neighbor to the Broderick family. I am afraid I bring you difficult news." Cordelia's gloved hand tightened on the handle of her trunk. "What news?" "There has been an accident, Miss Ashford. 3 weeks ago up in the North Cut. A tree fell. Samuel Broderick is paralyzed from the waist down. He will not walk again. His brother Ezekiel has lost the use of his right arm. The youngest Barnabas took a branch across the face and is, I am sorry to say, disfigured. The whole family is broken, Miss Ashford." They sent me to meet you because they could not bear to come themselves. Cordelia did not move. She did not speak. She looked at Horace Blackwood, and something in her father's blood began to whisper a warning inside her chest, though she could not have said why. I am prepared, Blackwood continued, to offer you $300 in cash for the inconvenience you have been caused, more than enough to return you to Philadelphia in comfort. All I would ask in return is that you sign a simple statement releasing the Brodericks from their obligation. Given that Samuel can no longer be a proper husband, the Silver Pine holding will pass to me under the territorial laws governing incapacity, and I will see to it that the brothers are comfortably placed in a veterans' home in Denver. It is the kindest thing for everyone, Miss Ashford. It is the Christian thing. He held out an envelope. Cordelia could see the edge of the bank draft inside it. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the man. She looked at the mountains rising blue behind him. And in that moment, she understood something very clearly, the way she had understood the false entries in the ledger back in Philadelphia. Horace Blackwood was lying. She did not know yet what the lie was, but the shape of it was the same shape as the Reverend Thorne's lie, and she had sworn to herself on the night she left Philadelphia that she would never again sign a paper a man like that put in front of her. She took the envelope from his hand. She held it for a moment, and then in full view of Horace Blackwood and the sheriff and the two cattlemen, she tore it neatly in half and in half again, and she let the pieces fall onto the wooden planks of the platform. Mr. Blackwood, she said, and her voice did not shake, I made a promise before God to a man named Samuel Broderick. I did not make it to a pair of legs. I made it to a soul, and I intend to keep it. Will you kindly direct me to the Silver Pine Road? Horace Blackwood's face did not change, but something in his eyes did. Cordelia saw it. She had seen that look once before in the study of Reverend Thorne, and she knew what it meant. She had made an enemy. Miss Ashford, he said quietly, I do hope you know what you are doing. I hope so too, sir. Reverend Jedediah Crane came hurrying up the platform, then white-haired and out of breath, a prayer book clutched in his hand. Zeke Broderick had ridden to the parsonage at dawn to ask him to come. The old pastor took one look at the torn bank draft on the planks and at Horace Blackwood's frozen face and at the small blonde woman standing straight back beside her trunk, and he understood a great deal in a single glance. Miss Ashford, child, I am Reverend Crane. I am a friend of the Brodericks. If you are still willing, we'll take you to them. I am still willing, sir. Then come, the wagon is around the front. Cordelia lifted her trunk. Zeke was waiting by the wagon with the reins in his left hand, his right arm bound in a leather sling, his face drawn from pain and from something deeper than pain. When he saw her, he straightened as best he could, and he removed his hat, and he said, Miss Ashford, I am Ezekiel Broderick. I am my brother's second. Welcome to Colorado. Thank you, Mr. Broderick. It is a long ride to the ranch, 2 hours or thereabouts. I should warn you, my brother does not know I sent for the preacher. He intends to send you back on the next train. Cordelia climbed into the wagon. She arranged her skirts. She looked straight ahead at the mountains. Mr. Broderick, she said, with all due respect, your brother does not know me yet. Zeke looked at her for a long moment, and then for the first time in 3 weeks, something close to a smile flickered across his drawn face. No, ma'am, he said softly. I do not suppose he does. He flicked the reins and the wagon rolled out of Oak Haven toward the mountains. The sun was low and gold over the western range when they came up the last rise and Silver Pine Ranch came into view. It was smaller than Cordelia had pictured. The cabin was 2 stories of dark weathered logs with a stone chimney and a wide porch and a barn off to one side and a small family graveyard on the hill behind it. A single lamp burned in the front window. Cordelia saw that lamp and knew that someone inside had been watching the road. Zeke brought the wagon to a stop at the porch. Reverend Crane climbed down, and Zeke handed Cordelia down, with his left hand and the door of the cabin swung open. Barnabas Broderick stood in the doorway. The scar on his left cheek was still raw, still healing a cruel red line from cheekbone to jaw, that pulled the corner of his mouth into something that looked at first glance like a permanent grimace. He was the tallest of the three, perhaps 6 feet 7 in his boots, and he held himself very still the way a deer holds itself still when it is afraid. He was a man who had prepared himself to be stared at. Cordelia walked up the porch steps. She stopped in front of him. She looked him in the eye, and she did not look at the scar, and she did not look past it either. She looked at him. "Mr. Broderick," she said, "I am Cordelia Ashford. I am pleased to meet you." Barnabas could not seem to speak for a moment. Then he stepped aside and he said very quietly, "Ma'am, please come in." The front room was warm with the smell of wood smoke and coffee. A kettle sang softly on the stove, and in the center of the room, in a chair made of oak and canvas and cast iron wheels, sat Samuel Broderick. Cordelia had thought she was prepared. She had rehearsed this moment on the train. She had told herself she would not flinch, she would not pity, she would not let the first moment break her. But when she saw him sitting there, a wool blanket across his useless legs, his broad shoulders still straight, with the habit of authority, his eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight, she felt something shift inside her chest that she could not have named if her life had depended on it. Samuel did not speak at first. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the room was very quiet. "Miss Ashford," he said finally. His voice was deeper than she had imagined, rougher, worn down by 3 weeks of pain. "I wrote you a letter 3 months ago. I was a different man then. I owe you an apology, and I owe you the truth. I cannot be a husband to you. Not now, not ever. I will pay your passage back to Philadelphia tomorrow morning, and I will ask God to forgive me for the trouble I have caused you." Cordelia did not answer right away. She crossed the room slowly. Reverend Crane stepped back against the wall. Zeke stood by the door with his hat in his left hand. Barnabas watched from the kitchen. And Cordelia Ashford, 22 years old, the daughter of a chaplain, the girl who had torn up $300 on a train platform, knelt down in front of the wheeled chair of a man she had never met. And she took Samuel Broderick's large calloused hand in both of hers, and she held it as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "Mr. Broderick," she said, and her voice was soft, but it filled the room. "My father was a chaplain in the war. He came home with a limp in a library, in a belief that a man is not measured by his legs or his hands or his face. He is measured by the words he keeps. The man who wrote me that letter 3 months ago kept every word he wrote. I have read that letter 100 times between Philadelphia and Oak Haven, and I have come to believe that the man who wrote it is still sitting in this chair. If you tell me you do not want me, I will go. But do not tell me you are not worthy. That is not your decision. That is mine, and I have already made it." Samuel Broderick, the eldest son of Eliah Broderick, the man who had not wept since the day they lowered his father into the ground, felt something break open in his chest that had been locked for 34 years. He could not speak. He could not look away. He simply held her small hands in his large one, and he bowed his head, and for a long moment, no one in the room said anything at all. Reverend Crane cleared his throat very gently. "Well now," he said, "if we are of one mind, perhaps we should not keep the Lord waiting." They were married that evening in the front room of the cabin by the light of 2 oil lamps and a crackling fire. Zeke stood as witness with his hat over his heart. Barnabas stood behind Samuel's chair with one large hand resting on his eldest brother's shoulder. Cordelia held a small bouquet of wild asters that Barnabas had cut from the dooryard without a word. When Reverend Crane asked Samuel if he took this woman to be his lawful wedded wife, Samuel looked at Cordelia for a long moment, and then he said, "I do." When the Reverend asked Cordelia, she did not hesitate. "I do." Samuel did not kiss her. He could not reach to stand, and she would not force him to be lifted. Instead, he took her hand in both of his, and he pressed it to his forehead, and he said, "God help me. God help us both." And Cordelia Ashford Broderick smiled for the first time since the train had crossed the Colorado line. That night, Samuel insisted that she sleep upstairs in the room that had once belonged to his parents. He would sleep in the chair by the fire as he had done every night since the tree fell. "You are my wife under the law, Cordelia," he said. But I will not ask anything of you that you are not ready to give. Not tonight, not ever. If a day comes when you choose to leave this house, I will honor that choice. That is my promise." She did not argue with him. She went upstairs. She unpacked her Bible and placed it on the nightstand. She knelt by the bed and prayed for a long time. And then she went to the window and looked out at the dark mountains, and she whispered to her father wherever he was that she had kept her word. Downstairs, Samuel Broderick did not sleep either. He sat by the fire with his useless legs covered by a quilt, and he listened to his brothers breathing in the back room, and he stared into the coals, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he allowed himself to feel something other than shame. He did not know that 5 miles down the valley in a lamplit study, Horace Blackwood was at that very moment drafting a letter to a forger in Denver requesting a promissory note dated 3 years prior and bearing the signature of one Elias Broderick in the amount of $8,000. He did not know that the next morning Blackwood himself would ride up to the porch of Silver Pine Ranch and present that forged note as proof of a debt his father had never owed, demanding payment in 60 days or forfeiture of the entire property. He did not know that his new wife, with the bookkeeper's eye her father had trained, would see the forgery in less than a day. He did not know that in 6 months she would save all their lives in a snowstorm. He did not know that in 1 year, on the very same date he had married her, he would stand in the main street of Oak Haven on his own 2 legs and confront the man who had murdered his father. He only knew that a woman from Philadelphia whom he had never met had crossed a continent to keep a promise to him. He knew it, and he could not understand it, and in the deep, silent country of his heart, where he had not dared to hope for anything in a very long time, something small and stubborn began very quietly to grow. Outside, the wind came down from the Sangre de Cristos, and the stars wheeled slow over Silver Pine Ranch, in the first chapter of a story that the town of Oak Haven would tell for generations had begun. The morning after the wedding broke slow and cold over Silver Pine Ranch. Frost lay white on the dooryard grass, and the pines on the high ridge stood black against a sky the color of milk. Cordelia Ashford Broderick, who had slept perhaps 2 hours in the bed that had once belonged to her husband's mother, rose before the sun and dressed in the gray dawn light. She smoothed her traveling dress, for she had no other. She pinned her honey-colored hair into a modest knot. She knelt once beside the bed and asked the Lord to make her useful to this family that had taken her in without knowing her, and then she went downstairs. Samuel was asleep in the chair by the fire. The quilt had slipped from his shoulders, and a white line of pain lay along his jaw even in his rest. Cordelia did not wake him. She stepped past him quietly, tied on an apron she found hanging in the kitchen, and began to build up the stove. By the time Barnabas came in from the barn with a pail of milk, there was coffee on the stove and biscuits rising on the board. By the time Zeke limped in behind him with his right arm still in its leather sling, there was a plate of fried ham and a dish of soft yellow eggs on the table. The two brothers stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared at her as though she were some kind of apparition. "Ma'am," Zeke said slowly, "when did you do all this?" "Before the sun came up, Mr. Broderick. I am an early riser. If it troubles you, I will try to be quieter tomorrow." "No, ma'am, it does not trouble me at all." Barnabas said nothing. He set the milk pail on the counter with a care he usually reserved for wounded animals, and he looked at the small blonde woman in her travel-worn navy dress, and something softened in the hard corner of his scarred mouth that had not softened in a long time. Samuel woke to the smell of coffee. He opened his eyes and saw his wife of one day moving about his kitchen as though she had lived there all her life, and he did not know what to do with the feeling that rose up in his chest. So he did what he had always done. He cleared his throat, and he asked Zeke to wheel him to the table, and he said grace over the meal in a voice that was steady and plain. That was the first morning. The second morning was the morning Horace Blackwood came. He rode up the track at 10 o'clock with a leather folio under his arm and Sheriff Merritt Brody at his shoulder. His black gelding was groomed to a shine. His coat was brushed. His silver mustache was freshly waxed. He climbed down from the saddle at the porch steps and tipped his hat to Cordelia as she opened the door. "Mrs. Broderick, Congratulations on your nuptials. I trust they were legally performed. Reverend Tran performed them, Mr. Blackwood. I believe the Reverend's authority is not in question. Indeed it is not. I have come on a small matter of business. May I speak with your husband? She brought him into the front room. Samuel sat in his wheelchair by the fire. Zeke stood at the window with his left hand resting easy on the butt of a Colt at his hip. Barnabas leaned against the kitchen doorway, silent as a standing stone. Blackwood did not seem to notice the weight in the room. He set the folio on the low table, and he drew out a paper with the careful ceremony of a man enjoying himself. Samuel, I am grieved to bring this to you so soon after your loss. But business is business. 3 years ago, in the autumn of 1878, your father, Elias, borrowed a sum of $8,000 from me against the title of this ranch. He was a proud man, and he did not wish you boys to know. The note has gone unpaid. With interest, it now stands at just under $9,200. I am giving you 60 days as a Christian neighbor before I am obliged to take the matter to the territorial court. He laid the promissory note on the table. Samuel picked it up with both hands, his face gone very still. He looked at it for a long moment, then he passed it without a word to his wife. Cordelia took the paper to the window. She held it up to the light. She ran one gloved fingertip down the ink of the signature. She compared the date stamp at the bottom to the notary's embossment. She said nothing for perhaps 30 seconds. Blackwood watched her with the indulgent amusement of a man watching a child pretend to read the newspaper. She turned from the window. Her face was mild. Mr. Blackwood, thank you for bringing this to our attention. My husband and I will study the matter with care and send word within the week. Mrs. Broderick, I would strongly advise your husband not to hire a lawyer. Lawyers only complicate these neighborly arrangements, and they are very expensive. We shall bear that in mind, sir. Blackwood smiled, tipped his hat once more, and took himself out of the room. The sheriff followed. The sound of hoofbeats receded down the track, and for a long moment nobody inside the cabin moved. Then Samuel said quietly, Cordelia. Yes. What did you see? She came and knelt beside his chair. She laid the forged note across his knees. 3 things, Samuel. The signature is not your father's hand. I compared it to the letter in his coat pocket last night while I was unable to sleep. The loops on the E and on the B are wrong. A man does not change the way he forms his letters after 40 years of writing them. Second, the notary stamp is from a firm in Denver that by the date on this note had not yet opened for business. Third, the ink on the signature is slightly darker than the ink in the body of the note. The 2 were written at different times, probably by different hands. Samuel looked down at the paper. Zeke stepped away from the window and came closer. Barnabas moved in from the kitchen. The 3 brothers stood around the chair reading the forgery with the new eyes she had given them. Sam, Zeke said, and there was something dangerous in his voice now. Father never borrowed $1 from any man in his life. He told me so the week before he died. I know it, Zeke. Then Blackwood forged this. He forged it knowing Father was dead and could not contradict it. I know that too. Cordelia stood up. She smoothed her skirt. Gentlemen, may I suggest that we not tell Mr. Blackwood what I have found? Not yet. Let him believe we are frightened. Let him believe we are looking for the money. A man who thinks he is winning grows careless. A careless man leaves tracks. We have 60 days. I should like to spend them learning what else that man has done in this valley. Samuel looked up at his wife, and for the first time since the tree had fallen, he smiled. That night, after the dishes were cleaned and the lamps were trimmed low, Cordelia went out to the front porch. The stars were fierce and close overhead. Barnabas was already there sitting on the porch step with his back against the rail, a pipe unlit in his hand. She sat down beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The scar on his left cheek showed pale in the starlight. Mr. Broderick, she said finally, Barnabas, ma'am, or Barn, I am not a mister to my brother's wife. Barnabas, then. May I ask you something? You may. The children in town, do they call you a name? He was very still for a long moment. They do, ma'am. What is the name? Scarbarn. She nodded slowly as though confirming something she already knew. Then she reached out very simply and she laid her small, gloved hand along the ridged line of the scar on his cheek. He flinched once like a horse that has been struck before, and then he went still. Barnabas, she said, my father was a chaplain at Antietam. He used to tell me that every scar on a man is a sentence in a book only God gets to read. This is not an ugly sentence. This is the sentence where you stood in front of the falling tree to keep your brothers alive. Do not let a pack of children in Oak Haven write a different ending for you. Barnabas Broderick, who had not cried in the whole of his 32 years, pressed the heel of his free hand hard against his good eye. He did not answer her. He did not need to. The pipe in his other hand was trembling. After a minute or two, Cordelia rose and went quietly inside and left him alone with the stars. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Cordelia took over the kitchen, the mending, and the household books. She moved Samuel's chair closer to the window each morning so he could see the horses in the corral. She began a program of physical care for her husband that startled him with its ferocity. Twice a day, she mixed a liniment of mustard seed camphor oil and comfrey root, and she worked it into the muscles of his thighs and calves with a patient, relentless pressure. The first time she did it, he turned his face away in shame. The third time, he closed his eyes and did not turn away. The seventh time, he said under his breath, I can smell the camphor. That is new. I have not smelled anything in the room clear down to my boots since the tree. She did not let herself show him the hope that rose in her throat. She worked with Zeke, too. She watched him struggle with a fork at the breakfast table one morning, his left hand clumsy where the right had once been practiced, and that afternoon she went to the barn and set up 6 tin cans on the corral fence and handed him his colt. Mr. Broderick, your right hand will heal as it heals. The Lord will decide that, but your left hand is young and stupid, and we are going to teach it to do the work. Zeke stared at her. Ma'am, I am a two-handed shooter. A man does not learn to shoot left-handed at 34. Perhaps not, but a man who has just been told by Horace Blackwood that his father borrowed $8,000 had better learn something, Mr. Broderick. Do you not think so? He took the colt. He missed the first can by a foot. He missed the second by 6 inches. By the 20th shot, he clipped the edge of the third can. By the end of the week, he was hitting 4 of 6. By the end of the month, he was the second fastest left hand in the county, and nobody living knew it but his family and the cans on the corral fence. With Barnabas, she did the most delicate work of all. She began to take him with her into Oak Haven on market days. The first Saturday, he did not want to come, and she did not push him, but she did not leave the house without him either. And on the second Saturday, he climbed into the wagon without being asked. When the butcher's boy on Main Street stared at his cheek and whispered to a friend, Cordelia knelt down in front of the boy and fixed him with the cornflower blue eyes her father had said could stop a runaway horse. Young man, do you know what this man did to earn this mark on his face? The boy shook his head. He put himself between a falling tree and his own brothers. He took it so they would not have to. There is not a man in this town, boy, who has ever done anything so brave. You will take off your hat to Mr. Broderick when he passes you on the street, and you will say, good day, sir. Can you do that for me? Can you do? The boy nodded wide-eyed. And the next Saturday and every Saturday after it, the boys of Oak Haven took off their hats to Barnabas Broderick on the wooden sidewalks, and slowly, week by week, the name Scarbarn died quietly in the dust where it belonged. 3 weeks after the forged note, Hackett came at them. It was a Tuesday, and Cordelia had driven the buckboard into town with Barnabas on the bench beside her to buy flour and a bolt of calico. On the road home at the bend where the trail dipped into the cottonwoods along Silver Creek, 3 riders stepped their horses out of the brush and blocked the track. Hackett was in the middle. He had a thin, nervous man on his left and a big, red-headed man on his right. All 3 had drawn revolvers. Cordelia pulled the team to a stop. Her hand moved very slowly toward the shotgun under the seat. Easy now, Mrs. Broderick, Hackett had called out. Mr. Blackwood sends his compliments. He has been thinking that 60 days is an awful long time for a widow with a crippled husband to be fretting about debt. He is wondering if you might not rather take his kind offer today, right here for $200 in a ticket east. Cordelia looked at him steadily. Mr. Hackett, I am not a widow. My husband is alive. Please move your horse from the road. Hackett grinned. Or what, ma'am? Two things happened at once. The first was that Barnabas, who had been sitting perfectly still on the bench beside her, with his hands folded in his lap, flicked his right wrist. A long, bladed skinning knife came up from under his coat and turned once in the air and buried itself to the hilt in the meat of Hackett's right shoulder. Hackett howled, and his revolver tumbled into the dust. The second was that from the brush on the far side of the road, a rifle spoke one time, and the red-headed man's hat lifted straight off his head and flew 10 feet into the willows. He did not wait to find out where the next shot was going. He spun his horse and kicked hard and was gone down the trail at a full run. The thin man looked at Hackett, looked at the brush where the rifle had spoken from, and dropped his own revolver into the dust and raised his hands. Ezekiel Broderick walked his horse out of the cottonwoods with a Winchester balanced easy across his saddlebow. He held it in his left hand as though he had been born with it there. He did not say a word. He rode up to Hackett, reached over and pulled his brother's knife out of the man's shoulder with a single steady motion. He wiped the blade on Hackett's coat and passed it back up to Barnabas. Mr. Hackett, Zeke said mildly, you will ride on out of here, and you will tell Horace Blackwood that the next man he sends down this road will be carried home across his own saddle. Are you hearing me clearly? Hackett nodded, white-faced. Zeke slapped the rump of his horse, and the two remaining men disappeared into the dust. On the long, slow drive back to the ranch, Barnabas sat quietly with his knife cleaned and sheathed, and his hands folded in his lap exactly as they had been before. After a mile or so, Cordelia spoke without turning her head. Barnabas, ma'am, you and your brother planned that. We did. You have been riding the road behind me every time I go to town. Every time, ma'am, Zeke or me, since the day you came. She was quiet for a moment. I am very grateful to you. Ma'am, Barnabas said softly, you walked into our house and you called a broken man by his Christian name. There is not a thing in this valley that my brother and I would not do for you. You ought to know that now. Cordelia nodded slowly and she blinked hard at the road ahead, and she did not trust herself to say anything more. That night, after Samuel had been helped to bed, Zeke stayed up with Cordelia at the kitchen table. A single oil lamp burned between them. He had a cup of coffee. She had a cup of chamomile tea that she had begun making for him every night, though she had never told him why. Miss Cordelia, he said. He had taken to calling her that respectfully, the way a younger brother speaks to an older sister. I need to tell you a thing. Yes. I rode out last week to talk to Doc Higgins. The old man has a gambling problem. Blackwood owns his notes. I put a gun on the table between us, and I asked him some questions. Cordelia set down her tea. What did he tell you? He told me father did not die of lung fever. He told me Blackwood had brought him a bottle of tonic to prescribe for the cough, and he told me he poured it down father's throat himself because Blackwood had his marker for $400. He told me he has known for 6 months, and it has been eating him alive. He wept like a child at my kitchen chair. Cordelia covered her mouth with one hand. Zeke. There is more. The tree, the one that fell on Sam. Doc went up there the next day with the coroner to certify the injuries. He said the stump was cut 3/4 through from the downhill side with a cross-cut saw, and somebody had scattered pine needles over the fresh cut to hide it. He said he knew the minute he saw it. He said he signed the paper anyway, because Blackwood owns him, and because he is a coward. Cordelia was silent for a long time. Does Samuel know? No, ma'am, not yet. I mean to tell him, but I wanted you to know first. Because I will be honest with you, Miss Cordelia. When Doc told me about father, I rode halfway to Blackwood's place with a rifle across my saddle. I meant to kill him. I was 2 miles from his gate before I turned around. What turned you around? I thought about what Sam would say. He would say we cannot be murderers. He would say the law is slow, but the law is forever, and what is not done by the law is not done by God. Cordelia reached across the table and laid her small hand over Zeke's calloused left one. Your brother is right, Ezekiel, but the law is going to need help, and we are going to help it. They told Samuel in the morning. He listened without moving. When Zeke was finished, Samuel closed his eyes and sat very still for a long time, and the three of them watched his face and no one spoke. Finally, he opened his eyes. Barnabas. Yes, Sam. Saddle smoke for Zeke and saddle gunpowder for yourself. You will ride to Denver tomorrow, both of you. There is a man called James McParland. He is a Pinkerton. Father met him once in 1875 over a rustling matter in this county, and he said McParland was the one honest lawman he had ever known. You will tell him the whole story. You will carry with you every letter of Father's we can find that bears his signature, so McParland can see the forgery. And you will ask him to come quietly to Silver Pine before the first snow. Yes, Sam. And you will tell Cordelia goodbye tonight, both of you, because she is the one who saved this family. And if Blackwood gets to her while you are gone, I will hold you responsible, even from this chair. Zeke and Barnabas rode out at first light the next morning. Cordelia stood on the porch with Samuel in his chair beside her and watched them go until they were two small shapes against the eastern plain. Then she wheeled Samuel back into the cabin and bolted the door behind them. They were gone 8 days. On the 5th day, Cordelia sat on the floor beside Samuel's bed with his right foot in her lap, and she pressed her thumb hard into the arch of it, and Samuel gasped aloud. Samuel, what did you feel? I felt that, Cordelia. I felt that. Do it again. She did it again. He gasped again. His toes curled just slightly, not a spasm, a movement, small as a candle flame and just as unmistakable. She laid her forehead against his knee. She could not speak. Samuel's hand came down and rested on her hair very gently. She felt him shaking. Cordelia, my love. It was the first time he had called her that. She did not lift her head for a long time. She did not need to. On the 8th day, Zeke and Barnabas rode back into the yard at dusk, their horses blown their faces gray with road dust. James McParland had heard them out in his office in Denver. He had taken the letters. He had told them he would come to Silver Pine in October under the cover of a hunting trip, and he would bring 2 men with him. He had also told them something else. Horace Blackwood was not a name born in Colorado. The man who called himself Horace Blackwood had under another name left Chicago in 1868, one step ahead of a warrant for the murder of 2 business partners. McParland had known it for years. He had been waiting patiently for a reason to come west and collect him. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Cordelia Ashford Broderick sat at the supper table with 3 strong brothers on 3 sides of her, and she bowed her head and she said the grace her father had taught her as a child. When she opened her eyes, Samuel was looking at her with something in his face she had not seen there before. Something that was not shame and was not pain and was not even hope. It was a plan. Outside the cabin, the first hard wind of autumn came down off the Sangre de Cristos and rattled the shutters, and up on the hill, the pines stood dark against the sky, already turning the iron-gray color of coming snow. October came down on Silver Pine Ranch like a hand closing slowly over the valley. The aspens along the creek turned the color of beaten copper, and the high peaks wore their first caps of snow, and the wind that came through the pines at night had a voice in it that the old people of Oak Haven called the voice of the year, saying goodbye. Inside the cabin, a different kind of preparation was underway. Samuel Broderick could now feel his feet. He could feel the cold of the floor through his boots in the morning. He could feel the heat of the stove when Cordelia rolled him too close to it. He could twitch the toes of his right foot on command, and by the 3rd week of October, he could twitch the toes of his left foot as well. He could not stand. He could not move his legs against the weight of the quilt. But the dead country below his waist had begun inch by stubborn inch to remember that it was still alive. Cordelia did not let him rest. She increased the massages to 3 times a day. She made him sit for an hour each afternoon with his legs lowered from the chair and his bare feet planted on the wide plank floor so that his body could remember what it was to bear weight. She made Zeke build a parallel set of rails in the front room waist high so that Samuel could begin to haul himself upright between them on the strength of his arms alone. The first time he tried it, he lasted 4 seconds before his legs folded under him and Barnabas caught him. The second time, 6 seconds. By the end of October, half a minute. He did not speak much about it. None of them did. To speak too loudly of hope in a house where hope had been a stranger for a long time felt like tempting the Lord to take it away. It was on a cold, bright morning in the last week of October that Cordelia raised the matter of the North Ridge. They were at breakfast. Zeke was buttering a biscuit with his left hand. Barnabas was drinking coffee in silence as he always did. Samuel was sitting at the head of the table in his chair, a plate of ham and eggs in front of him that Cordelia had cut into small pieces without being asked. "Samuel," Cordelia said, "I have been thinking about something. Mr. Blackwood forged a note for $8,000 on land that by his own word is fit only for grazing. $8,000 is a great deal of money to pay for grass. I should like to know what is on the North Ridge that he believes is worth killing a man for." Samuel set down his fork. He looked at his brothers. "Father used to go up there alone," Zeke said slowly. 2 or 3 times a year. He would be gone a day. He never said what he did up there. I thought he was checking fence." "There is no fence on the North Ridge," Barnabas said. "I ran it myself 5 years ago. The ground is too broken for fence." Samuel looked at his wife for a long moment. "We will go today." It took an hour to prepare. Zeke and Barnabas rigged the buckboard with extra blankets and a pulley block they could use to lift Samuel down at the other end. Cordelia packed a noon meal of cold beef and biscuits. Samuel insisted on bringing the Sharps rifle across his knees, and none of them argued with him. They rolled out of the yard at mid-morning with the sun white and hard in a sky the color of a washed denim shirt. The track up the North Ridge had not been traveled in a long time. Barnabas rode ahead on his horse breaking brush. The wagon creaked and swayed over frozen ruts. Cordelia drove the team while Samuel watched the country open out around them, ground he had not seen in almost a year. A hawk circled above the ridgeline. The wind carried the smell of stone and sage. They stopped in a small, natural bowl beneath an overhang of rim rock. Barnabas tied the horses. Zeke and Barnabas lifted Samuel down in the canvas sling Cordelia had sewn for him, and they set him gently on a folded blanket with his back against a warm, flat boulder. The sun fell across his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, and Cordelia saw his lips move in a silent word of thanks. It was Barnabas who found the cave. He had been casting along the base of the rim rock with the patient, foot-by-foot attention of a man who had spent his life reading ground, and he had stopped beside a stand of mountain juniper that grew too thick to be natural. He pulled 3 of the junipers aside, and behind them lay a dark, narrow opening in the face of the rock, half a man's height and no more. "Sam." They all came. Cordelia lit a candle lantern. Zeke went in first with his Colt drawn in his left hand. Barnabas followed. Cordelia went third with the lantern. And behind her, by the labor of his own arms, dragging his body across the stone, came Samuel Broderick. The passage opened into a chamber the size of a small parlor. The lantern light showed walls of dark rock streaked with something that caught the flame and threw it back in small, hard glints. Samuel hauled himself up to one of the walls. He scraped a small piece loose with his knife. He rolled the fragment in his palm in the yellow light. "Sam," Zeke whispered, "what is it?" Samuel did not answer for a long time. Cordelia watched his face. She saw something pass across it that she had not seen before. Not joy, not greed, something closer to grief. "Tellurium," Samuel said, "a vein of tellurium ore. And where you find tellurium like this in these mountains, Zeke, there is almost always gold beneath it, a great deal of gold." Nobody spoke. Cordelia set the lantern down on a flat stone, and it was then that her eye caught the corner of the old cedar chest pushed back against the far wall of the chamber and half covered with a piece of weathered canvas. She went to it. She folded back the canvas. The lid was not locked. Inside lay a leather-bound book, a bundle of letters tied with a leather thong, and a small tin of pipe tobacco that still carried the faint smell of their father. Cordelia lifted the leather-bound book into the lantern light. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was a handwriting she had already studied once 2 months earlier by the window in the front room of the cabin. It was the handwriting of Elias Broderick. "Samuel," she said quietly, "your father kept a journal." They took the chest home in the buckboard. That night, the four of them sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned high, and Cordelia read aloud from the journal of Elias Broderick in a soft, steady voice, while the wind rose outside against the shutters. He had found the vein in the summer of 1878. He had told no one. He had written in the journal page after page the reasons for his silence. Silver Pine Ranch stood on the open range in a lawless county. A strike of this size made known would bring to the valley every gambler and claim jumper and paid killer from Denver to the Mexican line. He had watched what had happened to other men who had struck it rich in these mountains. He had seen one miner found face down in his own creek the day after his claim was filed. He had seen another man's widow driven from her home inside a week. He had written in a hand that trembled with what was either age or fear that he meant to die before he told his sons. Because once they knew, they could not unknow, and once the world knew, the world would come for them. But he had also written a letter. It was the last item in the chest. It was addressed in his careful hand simply, "To my sons." Cordelia unfolded it and passed it across the table to Samuel without reading it herself, for she felt that those words did not belong to her. Samuel read it aloud in a voice that was low and rough. "My boys, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have found what I could not bring myself to show you while I lived. The ridge is yours. It was always yours. I kept it secret because I was afraid, and I was a coward for it, and I ask your forgiveness. Do not sell it. Do not let any man take it from you by force or by paper. Your mother and I paid for this ground with 30 years of our lives, and it is the one good thing I have to leave you. Be careful of Horace Blackwood. He is not what he seems. I have reason to believe he already knows. I pray God I am wrong. If I am not, then defend yourselves and each other and trust in the Lord and take a wife Samuel, a good woman of plain heart, because no man should fight this kind of fight alone. Your loving father, Elias Broderick." The cabin was silent when Samuel finished. Zeke was looking down at the table. Barnabas was looking at the ceiling. Cordelia sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes wet. "He knew," Samuel said softly. "He knew Blackwood had come for it. That is why he wrote the letter to Philadelphia. He was not trying to give me a wife. He was trying to give this family a shield." Cordelia reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "Samuel, he gave you both." 2 weeks later, on the night before Thanksgiving, the storm came. It came the way storms come in the high country, fast and black, with no proper warning beyond the sudden drop of the glass on the wall and a certain thickening of the air above the peaks. By nightfall, the wind was screaming off the ridges. By midnight, the snow was coming sideways and piling against the windward wall of the cabin in drifts as tall as a man. And under the cover of that storm, Hackett came back. He brought 6 riders this time. They left their horses half a mile down the track where the drifts swallowed the sound of the hoofbeats, and they came up on foot through the blowing snow with their faces muffled and their rifles wrapped in oilcloth against the wet. They meant to burn the barn first so that the horses would die and there would be no pursuit. They meant to burn the cabin after with whoever was inside it. They did not know that Barnabas had been setting bear traps in the snow around the yard every night for the past 3 weeks. They did not know that Zeke had cut firing loopholes into the loft of the barn and the upstairs bedroom in the back wall of the kitchen. They did not know that Samuel Broderick, for the last 11 days, had been standing between the parallel rails his brothers had built for him in the front room for 2 minutes, then 3, then 5. And that on the afternoon of that very day, he had walked with both hands on the rails and his wife walking backward in front of him, the full length of the room and back 12 feet there and 12 feet home without falling. Barnabas heard them first. He had a hunter's ear even indoors, and something in the wind changed, and he came up out of the chair by the fire like a shadow, and he laid his hand on Zeke's shoulder and then on Cordelia's. The three of them went to their places without a word. Cordelia took her father's army Colt, which she had been practicing with all autumn, and climbed the stairs to the upstairs bedroom loophole. Zeke took the Winchester and slipped out the back door and ghosted across the yard to the loft of the barn. Barnabas took his long rifle and settled at the kitchen loophole, and Samuel Broderick, who had not held a gun, pointed at another man in nearly a year, took up the Sharps buffalo rifle from the rack above the mantel and laid it across his knees in the wheeled chair at the front window, and he pulled a blanket up to his chest to hide the iron leg braces Silas Cobb, the blacksmith, had hammered out for him in secret 2 weeks earlier. He had tried the braces twice in secret, standing for 30 seconds at a time against the wall of the back bedroom. He did not yet know if they would hold him through the recoil of a rifle. The first man through the gate stepped on a bear trap. The sound was not loud in the storm, but it was enough. Hackett cursed and ordered his men forward. 3 of them broke for the barn with a torch. 2 of them came at the front of the cabin. 1 of them worked around the side toward the kitchen door. From the loft of the barn, Zeke Broderick put 2 shots into the torchbearer from 40 feet away, and the torch fell into the snow and guttered out. His left hand was as steady as his right had ever been. The second man of the 3 turned to run, and Zeke took him cleanly through the thigh. The third dropped his rifle and raised his hands. At the kitchen door, the man working around the side of the cabin put his boot on the step, and the step gave way under him where Barnabas had pried out the nails an hour before. He went down hard, face first, and Barnabas was already out the door above him with his skinning knife. What happened in the next few seconds happened in silence and did not need to be described. At the front of the cabin, the 2 remaining men, hearing the firing at the barn and no answering fire from the cabin, grew bold. They came up the porch steps with their rifles ready. The front door of the cabin swung open. Samuel Broderick stood in the doorway. Not in the chair, standing. He stood on the iron braces that had been locked onto his legs by his wife's small hands in the last quiet moment before the attack. He stood with his left hand braced against the door frame and the Sharps rifle in his right hand held at the hip. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall, and the wind took his hair, and the lamplight behind him threw his shadow out across the porch boards, and for a long, impossible moment, the 2 men in the yard forgot entirely why they had come. "Boys," Samuel said, and his voice carried in the storm, "you have made a bad mistake." They raised their rifles. Samuel fired once. The Sharps buffalo rifle is not a gentleman's weapon. The first man went down without a sound. The second man turned to run and made it 3 steps before Zeke's Winchester spoke from the barn loft and put him into the snow beside his companion. And then it was quiet except for the wind. Cordelia came down the stairs slowly with the Colt still in her hand. She saw her husband standing in the open doorway. She saw the Sharps lowered, now resting on his hip, smoke still curling from the muzzle. She saw the iron braces locked onto his legs under the wool trousers. She crossed the floor, and she put her arms around his waist, and she laid her face against his chest, and she did not say a word. Samuel's left hand came up very slowly and cradled the back of her head. "Cordelia." "Yes, Samuel. I am standing. I know, my love. I have wanted to stand for you for a long time. I know that too." They stood that way in the open doorway of the cabin for a long time, while the wind blew snow in around their boots. Barnabas came in from the kitchen, his knife already cleaned, and laid a hand briefly on his brother's shoulder and went back out to deal with what needed dealing with outside. Zeke came across the yard from the barn with his Winchester low, and he stopped at the foot of the porch, and he looked up at his oldest brother standing in the doorway, and he took off his hat, and he did not try to speak. Hackett himself was found an hour later face down in a drift 50 yards from the gate, his right leg taken clean by a bear trap, and the rest of him taken by the cold. Barnabas looked down at the body for a long moment, then he spat once into the snow and walked back to the cabin. In the morning, the storm had passed. The sun came up over a valley covered in white, and the yard at Silver Pine was very still. Zeke rode to Oak Haven at first light to bring back the sheriff of the neighboring county, a man named Hollis Gage, whom McParland had vouched for in his October visit. Gage arrived at mid-afternoon with two deputies and a clerk and took statements from everyone in the cabin. He looked at the bodies. He looked at the iron braces on Samuel's legs. He looked at the young woman with the honey-colored hair who had fired one shot from an upstairs window the night before and had caught a man in the shoulder at 30 feet in a blizzard. And he closed his notebook and he tipped his hat to Cordelia and he said, "Mrs. Broderick, I have been a peace officer in this territory for 18 years. I have never in my life had an easier report to write." A week later, a kiss. It was a morning after fresh snow. Samuel was on the porch with the braces locked and his hands on the rail, and Cordelia had just brought him a cup of coffee. The sun was coming up pink and gold over the eastern plain. He turned toward her, and she turned toward him, and neither of them said anything. He set the coffee cup down on the rail. He laid his large, weathered hand along the side of her face. He leaned down. She rose up to meet him. And under the cold, clean morning sun of the high country, Samuel Broderick kissed his wife for the first time. It was a short kiss. It was a quiet kiss. It said more than either of them could have said in 100 words. When it was done, Cordelia laid her forehead against his chest, and Samuel wrapped both arms around her shoulders, and they stood that way for a long minute while the smoke from the cabin chimney rose straight up in the still air. At the barn door 20 yards away, Zeke saw them. He touched the brim of his hat very gently and turned and went back into the barn. Barnabas, coming out of the chicken coop with a basket of eggs, saw them too. He did not turn away. He stood for a moment in the snow, with the basket on his hip, and he smiled with the scarred corner of his mouth, and he whispered to no one, "Well done, Father, well done." 3 days after the storm, a letter came from Denver. It was from James McParland. It was written on Pinkerton letterhead in a hand as neat as printed type. It ran to 4 pages. Zeke brought it up from the depot and set it on the kitchen table, and the 4 of them read it together by lamplight. McParland had done his work. He had traced Horace Blackwood back through Chicago to a man named Harold Blackstone, who had in 1868 poisoned 2 business partners over a land speculation and had fled west 1 step ahead of a murder warrant. The Chicago warrant was still good. The Federal Circuit Court in Denver under Judge Harrison Corwin would honor it and would hear the additional charges of murder fraud and conspiracy. McParland himself would come to Oak Haven with a deputy marshal and 4 Pinkerton men as soon as the snow broke in the passes. He proposed a date. He proposed a plan. The plan was a trap, and the trap required Horace Blackwood to speak certain words in the hearing of men he did not know were listening. "He will not speak them for us," Zeke said after the letter had been read through twice. "He will only speak them when he believes he has already won." Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at his wife across the table. "Cordelia, will you write Mr. Blackwood a letter?" "What shall I say, Samuel?" "Tell him that the widow has come to her senses. Tell him that her husband grows weaker by the day. Tell him that we have found no money, that we see no way out, and that we would be grateful if he would come to Silver Pine in the spring alone, if possible, to discuss the terms of a peaceful transfer of the property. Tell him we would prefer the matter be settled among neighbors without lawyers. Tell him that my wife will prepare him a supper." Cordelia looked at her husband. She saw the flat, quiet, patient fire in his whiskey-colored eyes, and she understood at once what he meant to do. "I will write it tomorrow, Samuel. Date it for March. Tell him May 14th for the meeting. The anniversary of our wedding. Let him believe that is a cruelty of timing. It will please him." "Yes, Samuel." Winter closed down around Silver Pine Ranch, then like a white door pulled shut. The snow came and came. The cattle were moved to the low meadow. The roof creaked in the wind. And inside the cabin, by firelight and by lamplight, a family that had been 4 strangers 8 months before, lived through the long, cold months together and became slowly and for good one thing. Samuel walked without braces by Christmas. He walked with a cane by the Feast of the Epiphany. He walked unaided with a slight limp by the end of February. In the last week of that month, on a night of fresh snow and a hard, bright moon, he knelt down on both knees in front of the fire, a thing he had not been able to do since the tree fell, and he took his wife's hands in his, and he asked her properly, and for himself alone, if she would do him the honor of being his wife. Cordelia Ashford Broderick, who had been his wife under the law for 9 months, looked down at the man who had walked back to her out of a country he had not been meant to leave. And she said yes, and yes, and yes again. That night they became husband and wife in every sense. When morning came, the snow on the eastern peaks was pink with sunrise, and the door of the cabin was still closed, and nothing in the silent country of the mountains would ever be quite the same. March came in wet and gray. Cordelia wrote the letter to Horace Blackwood on a Tuesday morning in a handwriting she made small and tremulous on purpose, the handwriting of a frightened woman with no choices left. Barnabas carried it into Oakhaven and left it with the postmaster and rode home without looking back. 3 days later, Blackwood's reply came. It was gracious. It was generous. It suggested that such an unpleasant matter could indeed be settled among neighbors without the nuisance of lawyers or courts. He would come to Silver Pine on May 14th as the lady requested, and he would bring the proper papers, and he would be honored to accept her hospitality. Samuel read the letter twice and laid it face down on the table and said, "He is bitten." The weeks that followed were the slow, careful weeks of a trap being set. James McParland rode in quietly at the end of April with a deputy marshal named Caleb Trent and 4 Pinkerton men. They camped out of sight in the high meadow above the North Ridge. They came down to the cabin at night, 1 or 2 at a time, and they studied the layout of the front room, and they measured distances to the hay barn and to the smokehouse, and they made their plan. A stenographer named Miss Edith Hale, an older woman from Denver with gray hair and the steadiest hand McParland had ever employed, was brought in on the morning of May 12th and hidden behind a false panel in the pantry with a notebook and 3 sharpened pencils. Reverend Crane agreed to be present as a neutral witness, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea in his hand, ready to open the door at the right moment. Zeke rode quietly down to Denver the week before and carried sealed copies of the journal, the forged note Doc Higgins' signed confession, and the bundle of their father's letters, and placed them all in the hands of Judge Harrison Corwin personally. The judge read the confession in his chambers and set his jaw and did not speak for several minutes, and when he spoke at last, he said, "Mr. Broderick, I will clear my docket for the 15th of May. You tell your brother I will be ready." On the morning of May 14th, the sun rose clean and bright over the Sangre de Cristos. Cordelia, dressed in the Navy traveling dress she had worn on the day she first stepped onto the Oakhaven platform. She pinned her hair in the same modest knot. She placed her mother's small cameo at her throat. Samuel asked her why she dressed so, and she said, "Because a year ago today I came to this valley believing I had come to keep a promise. Today I mean to finish it." Horace Blackwood rode up the track at noon. He had Sheriff Brody beside him and 4 riders at his back. He was in a good humor. He climbed down at the porch step and tipped his hat to Cordelia and said, "Mrs. Broderick, what a perfectly Christian gesture to settle this on a day of such personal significance. I hope you will not think me impertinent to say that you look remarkably composed for a woman in your circumstances." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Please come inside. My husband awaits you." She led him into the front room. Samuel sat in the wheelchair by the fire, a quilt across his lap, his face drawn in gray in the careful way they had rehearsed it all the previous evening. Zeke stood at the window with his right arm in a fresh sling, looking weaker than he had looked in months. Barnabas was nowhere in sight. Reverend Crane sat in the kitchen with his prayer book as agreed. Blackwood settled himself into the best chair without being asked and laid a folio of papers on the low table. "Samuel, you are looking poorly. I am sorry to see it, but let us conclude this business swiftly so that you may rest. I have prepared the transfer papers in a spirit of generosity. Sign here and here, and I will forgive the debt in full, and you and your brothers and your charming wife may remove yourselves to Denver at your leisure. The territory has fine veterans' homes. You will want for nothing." Samuel looked down at the papers. He took a long breath. "Mr. Blackwood, before I sign, I would ask one favor as a man about to lose everything he has. Anything within reason, Samuel. I would like to know plainly what happened to my father." Blackwood smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for the question for 6 months. "Samuel, your father was an old man with weak lungs. The winter was hard on him. These things happen." The tonic Mr. Blackwood, the bottle Doc Higgins, poured down his throat. Something in the room changed. Blackwood's smile thinned. His eyes flicked to Sheriff Brody at the door. "I do not know what you are talking about, Samuel. In the tree, Mr. Blackwood, the pine that fell on me in the north cut 3/4 through from the downhill side with a crosscut saw. Pine needles scattered over the fresh cut. I would like to know about that too." Blackwood stood up slowly. His face had gone the color of old ash. He looked around the room at the thin-drawn man in the chair, at the brother with the sling, at the closed door to the kitchen, and something in his eyes began to understand. "Samuel, if you mean to accuse me of something, you will do it in a court of law with proper evidence and not in your own parlor." "Oh, I mean to do it in a court of law, Mr. Blackwood. I am only curious first. Tell me one thing man to man with no lawyers present. Did you order my father poisoned? Did you order the tree cut? Say it once between us, and I will sign your papers, and we will part ways, and the Lord will judge us both." Blackwood stared at him. The house was very quiet. Somewhere in the kitchen, a cup chinked softly against a saucer. Outside, a crow called once from the top of the barn. And Horace Blackwood, for one fatal moment, believed that he had won. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I ordered the tonic. Your father was a stubborn fool who would not sell. Yes, I ordered the tree. Hackett cut it himself. It was supposed to kill all three of you. Do not look at me that way, Samuel. I did you a kindness. I left you alive." From behind the false panel in the pantry, the faint scratch of a pencil on paper was the only sound in the house. Samuel Broderick pulled the quilt from his lap. He stood up out of the wheeled chair. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall. He stood without braces. He stood without a cane. He stood like a man who had climbed up out of a grave on his own 2 legs, because that was exactly what he had done. Horace Blackwood's mouth fell open. The folio of papers slipped from his fingers and fanned across the floor. "Mr. Blackstone," Samuel said quietly, using the old name, the Chicago name, "I believe there are some gentlemen outside who would like a word with you." The kitchen door opened. Reverend Crane stepped out, his face pale. Behind him came James McParland and Deputy Marshal Caleb Trent, and 4 Pinkerton men with their revolvers already drawn. The pantry panel slid aside, and Miss Edith Hale emerged with her notebook in her hand, and her 3 pencils lined neatly along the top edge of the page, every word of Blackwood's confession caught in her careful shorthand. Sheriff Brody at his door reached for his sidearm. Ezekiel Broderick, whose right arm had been in a sling for show, drew his Colt cleanly with his left hand in less than a second and shot the revolver out of Brody's fingers without touching the man himself. The sheriff sat down hard on the floor and raised both hands and did not move again. Outside, the 4 riders who had come in with Blackwood looked up from their saddles to see Barnabas Broderick walk out of the barn with a long rifle across his arm and 2 more Pinkerton men on either side of him. They dropped their weapons into the dirt without a word. Blackwood made one last effort. He lunged for the door. Samuel Broderick, who had been a logger and a rancher and a man who had carried cattle on his shoulders in his youth, stepped forward once and brought his closed fist around in a short, hard arc, and Horace Blackwood, the killer from Chicago, the forger, the poisoner of old men, went down onto the planks of the front room floor and did not get up. McParland produced a pair of iron handcuffs and locked them around Blackwood's wrists himself. Then he turned to Samuel and extended his hand. "Mr. Broderick, your father spoke of you once. He said you were the finest man he knew. I am pleased to find he was right." Samuel took the offered hand. My father spoke of you also, Mr. McParland. He called you the one honest lawman he had met. I am pleased to find he was right as well. Cordelia stood in the doorway of the front room with one hand at her throat and the other holding the post of the kitchen archway, and she watched them take Horace Blackwood out to the waiting wagon, and she felt a great weight come off her shoulders that she had not known she was carrying. The trial in Denver was held in August of 1882. Judge Harrison Corwin presided. Miss Edith Hale's shorthand was entered into the record. Doc William Higgins, who had been persuaded by Zeke and by his own bad conscience to come forward, testified for 3 hours and wept at the end of it, and the judge, who had a soft heart beneath his hard face, sentenced him to banishment from the practice of medicine and from the territory of Colorado. And the old man boarded a train for Missouri the next morning to live out his days with a widowed daughter. Sheriff Brody was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. The surviving men who had ridden on Silver Pine the night of the storm received 20 years each. And Horace Blackwood, who had been Harold Blackstone, was found guilty on 7 counts, including 2 counts of murder, and was sentenced to hang. The sentence was carried out on a cold, gray morning in October. Samuel Broderick did not attend. His wife did not wish him to, and he did not wish to, and there was no duty in the world that required it. He was in the North Meadow with Barnabas when the time came mending a stretch of fence, and when the Oak Haven church bell rang noon, he took off his hat and stood with his head bowed for 1 full minute, and then he put his hat back on and picked up the hammer and went back to work. Back at the cabin, Cordelia Broderick was sitting at the kitchen table kneading dough for the evening bread. She had known for nearly 3 weeks by then, though she had kept the knowing close and quiet until she was sure. She told her husband that night after supper. He put his head in her lap and wept like a child, and Zeke stood in the doorway with tears running down his own face, and Barnabas went outside to the porch, because some joys are too large to witness without giving a man room. Elias Samuel Broderick was born in the last week of May, 1883, on a bright, clean morning when the wild iris were coming up along the south side of the cabin. He was named for his grandfather and for the man who had walked back to his mother out of the grave. He had his mother's cornflower blue eyes and his father's whiskey-colored hair, and he had a set of lungs on him that rattled the windows and made Barnabas laugh out loud, a thing that had not been a common sound in that cabin before. In the years that came, other joys came also. Ezekiel Broderick met a young widowed nurse named Winifred Langley in Denver in the autumn of 1883 when he rode down to testify at a secondary hearing. She had nursed soldiers during the war, and she did not mind in the least that his right arm was slow. They married in the spring of 1884, and she came to Silver Pine to live in the new cabin Zeke and Barnabas raised beside the original, and she and Cordelia became as sisters inside of a month. Their daughter Sarah was born in 1885. Barnabas took longer. He had told himself the scar was a wall no woman would climb. He had told himself that for a long time before Cordelia Broderick had informed him gently but firmly that he was wrong. In the summer of 1885, a family of Irish immigrants named O'Brennan came down the Oak Haven Road with a broken wagon axle, and Barnabas rode out to fix it for them, and the oldest daughter, Philomena, a tall, dark-haired girl with quick hands and a quicker tongue, looked up at the scar on his cheek and said, "Sir, that is a fine mark you carry. I hope the story behind it is worthy of it." They were married the next spring. Their son Thomas came along in the summer of 1887. Silver Pine Ranch grew. The tellurium vein on the North Ridge was filed under the name Broderick Brothers Mining Company and worked carefully and quietly with a small crew of honest men in a fair wage, and it paid for the new cabins and for a proper school in Oak Haven and for a new roof on Reverend Crane's church. The cattle increased, the horses ran fat in the summer meadows. The town of Oak Haven, which had once called Barnabas by a name that shamed him, now tipped its hats to all 3 Broderick brothers on Main Street and to the small blonde woman who walked beside the eldest with a basket on her arm and a child by the hand. The spring of 1888 came early and fair. Samuel Broderick, who walked now with only the slightest hitch when the weather changed, stood on the high porch of the cabin one May evening. with his wife beside him, and watched the sun go down red and gold behind the western range. Their son Elias was 5 years old that month, a tow-headed boy with his mother's eyes chasing his cousin Sarah across the dooryard grass, while Barnabas and Thessalomina's baby Thomas slept against his father's shoulder. Zeke came walking up from the barn with Winifred at his side, her hand through the crook of his elbow. A second child stirred under Cordelia's apron, not yet showing, not yet spoken of. "Samuel," she said, "do you remember the day I came?" "Every day of my life, Cordelia. My father used to say that the Lord does not close a door without opening another. When the tree fell on you, I thought a door had been closed. I thought before I ever met you that the Lord had taken from me the one good thing I had left. But the door the Lord opened was larger than I knew how to imagine. It was a whole country." Samuel drew her against his side. He looked out across that country. He thought of his father buried up on the hill behind the cabin, and of the letter in the old coat pocket that had started it all. He thought of the tree that fell the wrong way, and of the morning he had believed he would never stand again, and of the small, fierce woman who had knelt on a dusty train platform floor and torn $300 into pieces for the sake of a man she had never met. "Cordelia," he said, "yes. I used to wonder why the Lord allowed that tree to fall. I do not wonder anymore." "Why not, my love?" "Because if the tree had not fallen, I would have met you on the platform at Oak Haven, whole and strong and proud, and I would not have known how to love you the way you deserve to be loved. The tree taught me. It taught me to sit still and listen. It taught me to let a woman knit me back together with her own two hands. It taught me the only thing worth learning in this life, which is that no man stands on his own feet. He stands on the feet of the people who loved him enough to hold him up until he could. The tree did not take my legs, Cordelia. It gave me you. That is not a loss. That is the mercy of God." She did not answer. She laid her head against his shoulder, and they watched the last of the light leave the peaks, and inside the cabin, the lamps began to come on one by one. Zeke and Winifred went in with Sarah. Barnabas and Philomena followed with the baby. Elias came running up the porch steps with his arms full of wildflowers he had pulled for his mother, and Cordelia knelt down to take them from him, and her honey blonde hair caught the last of the sun the way it had caught the light on a Philadelphia train platform 7 years before. The town of Oak Haven told the story for 3 generations. They told it in the school and in the church and on the wooden sidewalks of Main Street. They told how a woman from Philadelphia came west with a single leather trunk and a letter she had read 100 times. They told how she tore $300 into pieces and kept a promise she had made to a stranger. They told how a tree fell the wrong way in the north, cut and broke a man into 3 pieces, and how his brothers came back from Gettysburg and from a grizzly bear and stood around him while his new wife refused to let him die. They told how Horace Blackwood, who had been Harold Blackstone, had believed that he could break that family with a forged note and a cut stump and a bottle of poison tonic, and how he had been wrong. They told how Samuel Broderick stood up out of a wheelchair on the 14th of May in the year of our Lord, 1882, and how he stood on his own 2 legs, and how the man who had tried to destroy him looked into his face and understood at last what kind of family he had chosen to fight. But mostly they told the smallest part of the story, the part that the Broderick children told their own children and that the Broderick grandchildren told their own. They told how on a spring morning after a blizzard, an old rancher with a slight limp stood on a porch with a cup of coffee in one hand and touched the face of the woman he had written one honest letter to, and how he kissed her under a pink and gold sky, and how somewhere out behind the barn, a man with a scar on his cheek stood in the snow with a basket of eggs on his hip and whispered to no one the only words that needed ever to be said. "Well done, Father, well done."